It did not start with a declaration of war. It did not start with a televised address from Buckingham Palace, or a royal proclamation read from the steps of St. Paul's Cathedral, or any of the forms that significant institutional moments usually take when the British monarchy has decided that something must be said. The most consequential shift in the modern history of the House of Windsor began in the dead of night, in a climate-controlled server room, with a cursor and a keystroke. In the silent, glowing infrastructure that houses the digital records of the British government, a single cursor flickered. It hovered over two names. And then, with a rhythmic tap that took less time to complete than it takes to draw a breath, decades of history were rewritten in a millisecond. Two names that had been etched into the digital ledger of the realm, names that had been presented to the world as symbols of a modern, multicultural future for the monarchy, simply vanished. There were no news conferences, no somber announcement from the Lord Chamberlain, no official explanation for the two vacant spaces where Archie Harrison and Lilibet Diana had stood. For the worldwide network of royal watchers who noticed within hours, this was not a technical glitch. They understood immediately, with the specific literacy of people who have spent years learning to read the monarchy's language of omission and absence and strategic silence, what a deletion of this kind meant and what it did not mean. It was a digital guillotine. A silent but absolute institutional strike that cut two children off from an inheritance they had been told since the day of their births was theirs by right of blood and name. But as the world scrambled to understand the mechanism, a far darker and more complex story began to emerge from behind the official silence, one that involved a careless remark in a Hollywood suite. A constitutional provision that had not been seriously tested in 3 centuries, a sealed financial trail leading to a Delaware shell company, and an envelope bearing a dead queen's wax seal, sitting for years in a Windsor archive with 5 words written on the outside in the most careful and deliberate handwriting in the history of the British monarchy. Those 5 words were, "to be opened when tested." They were written by Queen Elizabeth II. She wrote them in October 2022, less than a month before she died. And when the Lord Chamberlain finally broke that seal, the letter inside rewrote the story of everything that had happened, confirmed it, justified it, gave it the moral authority that constitutional law alone could not entirely provide. But the letter was not the beginning. The beginning was a room in Hollywood and a remark about Spark. This is the story of how 2 names disappeared from the digital ledger of the British realm, and why that disappearance was not an act of spite or revenge or family dysfunction, but the logical and legally documented conclusion of a process that had been building in sealed files and private audits and confidential legal opinions for years. It is the story of a monarchy that does not fight in public, does not argue in press conferences, does not prove its legitimacy through podcasts or branded merchandise, but that, when the moment comes, closes the doors with the quiet, irrevocable efficiency of an institution that has been doing exactly this, in one form or another, for 1,000 years. The remark that triggered the final sequence arrived in the early weeks of the year, from a high-level media strategy meeting in the heart of Hollywood. Meghan was, by all accounts, in her element, surrounded by the kind of image makers and global influence brokers who understand narrative as a currency and who had been working with her on the next phase of the Sussex brand's positioning. The atmosphere in the room, as people present would later describe it, was one of creative confidence, the energy of a group of professionals who believe they are good at what they do and are planning something significant. What happened next was not, in the assessment of those same people, a calculated strategic move. It was a moment of maternal pride that crossed a constitutional line so significant that, within hours, it would reach the desks of the palace's most senior advisors via encrypted channels. Meghan reportedly claimed that Archie had more spark than Prince George, that he was the one truly born for the limelight, the one who carried the quality that royal leadership actually required in the modern world. In any other family, this would be exactly what it appeared to be, a mother's competitive affection for her son, the kind of comment that gets made and forgotten between the soup course and the main. The Windsor family is not any other family. The House of Windsor is a constitutional machine in which hierarchy is not a preference or a tradition, but a structural reality that has been codified in law across centuries of political and dynastic conflict. Prince George Alexander Louis of Wales is not simply a child who happens to be the king's grandson. He is a state asset. Since the day of his birth, his trajectory toward the crown has been managed with a precision and a care that reflects the understanding that he is not being raised for himself, but for an institution that has its own specific requirements for what the person at its head must be and must not do. His schooling, his public appearances, his carefully managed exposure to public life, even his solitude, are all components of a system that has been producing kings for 1,000 years. To suggest, in a room full of media professionals, that a child raised in California carried more native royal quality than the heir to frame royal fitness as a matter of spark, rather than of birth and duty, and the specific sacrifices that the line of succession demands was to challenge, whether or not Meghan intended it as a challenge, the foundational principle of primogeniture. The throne is not a prize for the most charismatic candidate. It is not awarded on the basis of limelight or leadership quality as assessed by Hollywood image consultants. It passes through the constitutional line because the line is the thing, because the alternative to a clear, legally established line is the kind of succession dispute that the Act of Settlement of 1701 was designed in the specific political conditions of that era to prevent forever. The specificity of George's position in the constitutional machinery of the British state is something that the Hollywood framing of the Spark comment could not accommodate. Because the Hollywood framing was built on a set of assumptions about what makes someone suitable for a position of influence that are precisely the opposite of the assumptions on which the monarchy is built. In Hollywood, and in the broader celebrity culture that the Sussex brand had been designed to operate within, spark is a genuine qualification, the thing that makes an audience pay attention, that distinguishes a person who can build a platform from a person who cannot, that determines who rises and who remains peripheral. The monarchy's logic inverts this entirely. The heir is not the person with the most spark. The heir is the person born into the line who accepts the weight of what that position requires and who subordinates the personal version of their life to the institutional demands of the role. Spark, in the monarchy's assessment, is irrelevant at best and dangerous at worst. It is the quality that makes people prioritize their own narrative over the institution's continuity, which is exactly the problem the Sandringham Agreement had been designed to manage and which the Oprah interview had demonstrated was alive and operating. The palace did not respond with a statement. The palace never responds with a statement when it has a better tool available. In this case, the better tool was the coldest instrument in the institutional arsenal, erasure. But the deletion was not primarily a response to the Hollywood remark. The remark was the final provocation that made the deletion possible. The actual reason for it had been building quietly, in sealed documents and private legal opinions, and the specific kind of constitutional anxiety that institutions carry when they know something about themselves that they cannot say publicly for years before the cursor hovered over those two names. The true nature of the problem that had been quietly accumulating since 2019 became partially visible in mid-2025, when a series of leaked documents surfaced in connection with a disclosure to the Office for Constitutional Integrity. Records that had previously been sealed under strict government privacy provisions became accessible, and among them was a document that set off a chain of legal consultations inside the palace that would eventually produce the letters patent Charles signed. The document in question was a scanned intake form from a California fertility center dated April 2019. The world had been told, with the specific confidence of an official palace announcement, that Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor was born at the Portland Hospital in London on May 6, 2019, a perfect narrative for a royal birth, complete with the institutional details that made it legible as a continuation of the tradition. If the California document was genuine, it described something different. In the field designated for maternal source, It listed a designation that palace legal advisors, when they first reviewed it, described in internal communications as a constitutional emergency in waiting. In the column for intended parent, it listed Meghan Markle's name. The Act of Settlement of 1701 was written in an era of religious and dynastic warfare, when the primary threat to the stability of the British monarchy was the possibility of a Catholic claimant returning to a throne that Parliament had decided must remain Protestant. Its language reflected the concerns of that era, which is to say, it was written in terms that its authors would never have imagined needing to be applied to the questions that modern reproductive technology would eventually generate. But the principle embedded in its requirements was not merely procedural. It reflected a constitutional understanding that the succession must be verifiable, that the person inheriting the crown must be what the law says they must be, and that the integrity of the line depends on the integrity of every claim within it. Centuries of legal practice had established that an heir must be born of the body of a royal descendant and their legally married spouse. The specific phrase "born of the body" had never required extensive interpretation before the development of assisted reproductive technology, because the technology that would require it to be interpreted had not existed. By 2025, it required interpretation. And the internal legal opinions that palace solicitors prepared in the months after the California document became available concluded, with careful and qualified consistency, that a rigorous reading of the 1701 Act, as understood through its centuries of application, created a genuine question about whether a child born through surrogacy, in which the genetic and gestational and intended parent relationships might be distributed differently than the biological union the Act had assumed satisfied its requirements. The palace was not punishing Meghan for a remark made in a Hollywood strategy meeting. It was resolving a constitutional problem that it had been managing quietly through the specific mechanism of deliberate non-inquiry since 2020. And understanding why it had been managing the problem that way requires going back to Sandringham and to a summit meeting that the public had been told was about Harry's future happiness. But that was actually about something considerably more consequential than anyone outside the room had understood. The Sandringham Summit, the famous meeting at which the Queen, Charles, and William sat with Harry and negotiated the terms of the Sussex departure, had been presented publicly as a family discussion about how a prince who wanted a different kind of life could transition out of his working royal role in a way that respected both his wishes and the institution's needs. The framing was careful and the language was diplomatic, and the outcome, as presented, was a reasonable compromise between competing interests. Palace insiders now confirm that a provision was added to the final departure framework, designated Clause 7, Paragraph 3 inches, the internal documents that was a masterpiece of diplomatic vagueness. Its essential content, stripped of the legal language that surrounded it, was a mutual commitment to non-inquiry. The sovereign would withhold examination into matters of lineage, and in exchange, Harry and Meghan would withdraw from public duties and titles and live discreetly as private citizens. The terminology chosen for this provision was chosen with the specific care of lawyers who are drafting a document that they hope will never need to be invoked, but that they need to be watertight if it does. It was in the specific and unsentimental language of institutional crisis management, a deal based on mutually assured destruction. If the palace looked too closely at the circumstances of Archie's birth and what the Act of Settlement required, it created a constitutional crisis. If Harry and Meghan behaved in a way that forced the palace to look, the same crisis resulted, but this time accompanied by the additional damage of having been forced rather than managed. The ceasefire served both sides. The palace would not look. Harry and Meghan would not behave in a way that made looking necessary. The ceasefire was not comfortable for either side. It required the palace to maintain a policy of active non-inquiry into a matter whose constitutional implications it understood clearly enough to be concerned about, which meant that every decision about how to characterize Archie's position in the line of succession, every official reference to his status, every public communication that touched on his place in the royal family, had to be managed with the awareness that the foundation of that status was a question the institution had agreed not to ask. For Harry and Meghan, it required a restraint that was increasingly at odds with the communication strategy they were developing. The strategy of positioning themselves as survivors of institutional persecution whose story deserved to be told in full and told publicly. These two requirements were incompatible from the beginning. The question was not whether the ceasefire would eventually fail, but when. That ceasefire lasted until the Oprah Winfrey interview in 2021. Harry and Meghan did not merely discuss their personal anguish in that broadcast. They attacked the institution they had agreed to leave alone, characterized the palace as a cold and brutal machine, leveled accusations that positioned it as an active antagonist in their lives, and used the global platform of one of the world's most watched television events to damage, systematically and deliberately, the reputation of an institution whose protection of them had been the price of their silence. The Netflix documentary deepened the breach. The memoir deepened it further. With each public charge, the legal advisors who had drafted Clause 7, Paragraph 3 updated their internal assessments of whether the arrangement's conditions had been sufficiently violated to release the Crown from its side of the commitment. By late 2025, their consensus was that they had. The dam had not broken, but the structural integrity of the arrangement had been tested past the point at which the institution was obligated to honor it. The final piece of the evidentiary architecture arrived through the most mundane of institutional processes, a routine audit of the sovereign grant, the public money that funds the monarch's official obligations and that is subject to strict parliamentary oversight as a condition of its existence. The auditors were looking for the standard categories of potential irregularity that parliamentary oversight requires them to examine. What they found was not standard. A Delaware-based shell company designated Arch Genesis LLC had processed a series of financial transactions whose nature, once identified, made the auditors stop and verify again before escalating. The transactions included payments categorized as surrogacy agency fees, legal facilitation contracts, and medical expenses categories that individually might have explanations, but that in combination, traced to a specific time period and originating from a specific funding source, had an explanation that was considerably more difficult to manage. The source of the money traced back to the allocation that Parliament had designated for the renovation of Frogmore Cottage. Public funds, taxpayer money appropriated by Parliament for the specific purpose of maintaining a royal property, had apparently been used to fund a private surrogacy arrangement conducted on another continent. The auditor's discovery created a specific problem of verification that compounded the constitutional one. The constitutional question about the act of settlement was a legal question of interpretation. It required lawyers to apply old statutory language to circumstances that the statute's authors had not anticipated, and legal questions of interpretation, however well documented, carry an inherent arguability that makes them difficult to resolve definitively in a short time frame. The financial question was different. Financial records are specific. Wire transfers have dates and amounts and originating accounts and receiving accounts in memo fields. The Delaware Shell Company's transactions were documented with the precision that financial record keeping produces, a precision that does not allow the same space for interpretive disagreement that constitutional questions create. The palace now had, in the financial audit findings, the kind of evidence that does not require a legal opinion to understand. The monarchy was now facing a two-front problem of a kind that has historically been the most dangerous kind for any institution, a constitutional problem about the legal status of two children in the line of succession, and a political problem about the misuse of public money that connected the constitutional problem to the relationship between the Crown and Parliament, and through Parliament to the British tax-paying public. The period of quiet management was over. The relationship between the Crown and the people it served, mediated through the parliamentary accountability of the sovereign grant, was now at stake in ways that required action rather than continued careful non-inquiry. King Charles assembled a group of royal lawyers with the full backing of Princess Anne and the silent agreement of Prince William. Their task was not the management of public relations or the careful handling of a delicate family situation. It was the construction of a legal instrument that would resolve the constitutional question with the finality and the clarity that the accumulated evidence demanded and that the institution's integrity required. The tool they built was a letters patent, the formal public document issued under the sovereign's authority, bearing the great seal of the realm that has been used across centuries to establish and modify the conditions of royal succession. The modification Charles signed was surgical in its precision. Its main provision established that succession and the rights of title were reserved for those born of the valid biological union of a royal descendant and their recognized spouse. The specific phrase, lawful biological union, chosen with the deliberateness of lawyers who understand that every word in a constitutional instrument carries the weight of the cases that will be brought to test it. The provision applied backward as well as forward. It was not subject to future contest through the normal mechanisms of legal challenge. It was the Crown speaking with the authority that only the Crown can deploy in this domain, the authority of 1,000 years of constitutional practice condensed into a document bearing the Great Seal. The names of Archie and Lilibet were removed from the royal website within 36 hours of the paperwork being signed. The public witnessed the deletion. Almost nobody outside a very small circle understood the years of constitutional legal work and financial audit findings and sealed diplomatic provisions that had made it not just possible, but in the palace's assessment, necessary. The feeling inside the institution, according to those present in the meetings that preceded the signing, was not anger, it was closure. The quiet, heavy, relief-adjacent feeling of an organization that has been carrying a problem for a long time and has finally addressed it through the formal mechanisms available to it. Deep within the royal archives at Windsor, in the section reserved for documents of the highest institutional sensitivity, an envelope had been sitting in a sealed folder designated Kensington Protocol 14C. It was cream-colored, with the late Queen Elizabeth II's personal wax seal on the flap and 5 words written on the outside in her unmistakably careful, deliberate handwriting, to be opened when tested. Nobody who saw it during the years it sat in the archive opened it because the instruction on the outside was clear, and the person who had written it had been the most respected figure in British public life for 7 decades, and her instructions were not the kind that required second-guessing. When Meghan's public campaign to frame her children as unfairly treated heirs to a legacy that had been stolen from them reached a level that the Lord Chamberlain's office assessed as having met the threshold of the envelope's condition, the seal was broken. The letter inside was 1 page long. It was dated October 2022. Queen Elizabeth II died on September 8, 2022. The letter had been written in the final weeks of her life, when she understood that the end was approaching and wanted to leave something specific behind for the specific circumstance she had apparently concluded was coming. The content of the letter was not a legal instrument. It did not modify succession law or establish new titles or revoke existing arrangements. What it was, in the precise and considered language of a woman who had spent 70 years choosing her words with the care that the position demanded, was a moral statement. She wrote that she had seen enough of character and behavior in the issue of inheritance and example to know her own mind on the matter. She expressed her trust in William, Catherine, and their children. She said in the specific, unambiguous terms that she had never used in public, across decades of careful royal neutrality, that George should wear the crown, that Charlotte should keep its dignity, and that Louis should guard its grace. She stated that titles not won are not deserved, and that those who forsake duty cannot claim its privilege. The letter did something else as well. Beyond confirming the moral legitimacy of Charles's actions, it shifted the entire interpretive framework through which the events of the preceding years could now be understood. The Sussex narrative had been built around the proposition that the institution had failed Harry and Meghan, had treated them coldly, had denied their children their rightful place, had acted out of institutional rigidity rather than genuine care for the people inside it. That narrative had found audiences who were prepared to accept it, partly because the institution's habitual silence had left the Sussex framing to operate largely uncontested in the public conversation. The letter from the Queen ended that silence in the most authoritative possible way, not with a palace press release or a spokesperson's comment, but with the last recorded judgment of the woman who had understood the institution better than anyone alive. It was not legally binding. But the effect of its release, at the moment of its release, was the effect of a moral earthquake in the specific way that words carry additional weight when they come from someone who is no longer alive to be argued with, who spent their entire public life maintaining a restraint that makes a single departure from it resonate with extraordinary force. The Queen, who had said nothing in public across years of Sussex provocation, had said something in private that was now public. And what she had said was that she had made her choice about who the institution belonged to. And her choice was not Archie and Lilibet. Charles was not merely acting as king. He was, as his advisors would frame it in the days that followed, fulfilling his mother's final recorded wish. While the palace was completing the constitutional process that would produce the letters patent and the deletion, Meghan was preparing what she believed would be her most effective counteroffensive. A new trademark was registered through a holding corporation connected to Archwell Royal Reclamation. The product range that the trademark covered was a challenge to the monarchy's authority expressed through the specific language of the modern consumer marketplace: children's loungewear, storybooks whose themes involved lost birthrights, and a toddler's t-shirt bearing the legend, "Future King, but not yours." A teaser video appeared on social media, moving between soft focus shots of Archie in a California orchard and artificially faded footage from Queen Elizabeth's coronation. The juxtaposition designed to suggest continuity, inheritance, the natural passing of royal legitimacy from one generation to the next through a line that ran through Archie rather than around him. The campaign centerpiece was a picture book featuring a child called Little Lionheart, who stood in the shadows of a jealous court while a crown was given to a boy with blonde hair. The allegory required no decoding. The response in the Wales household when the picture book's content became known was described by people close to Catherine as something considerably beyond irritation. Livid was the word that circulated in the accounts of those who had access to her reaction. This was no longer a dispute between adults about institutional positions and legal interpretations and constitutional provisions. This was a public campaign that portrayed her son, an 11-year-old child who had done nothing to anyone, as the villain of a story whose moral was that he had been given something he didn't deserve at the expense of someone who deserved it more. Catherine understood in that moment what the campaign was attempting to accomplish and why it could not simply be tolerated. The palace's response was the response of an institution that has learned over centuries that the most effective answer to a provocation is not argument but administration. They engaged the College of Arms, the body responsible for heraldic authority in England, and issued cease and desist communications to every manufacturer and vendor who had taken on royal reclamation products. Princess Anne oversaw the operation with the methodical efficiency that is her characteristic contribution to any institutional challenge she is given responsibility for. A report documenting the inappropriate use of heraldic trademarks ran to 73 pages. Warnings went to streaming services that had used imagery associated with the royal family in their promotional materials for Sussex-connected content. The operation was not dramatic, it was thorough. And thorough, in the palace's experience, is what works. Catherine made one public gesture that required no explanation to anyone who understood what the moment needed. At a charity event in Leeds, she wore the Jubilee Star brooch, a piece of jewelry reserved by long and unbroken tradition for monarchs and their direct heirs. There was no press statement accompanying the choice. No royal spokesperson was asked to explain it. A blaze of diamonds communicated to everyone present and to the much larger audience that saw the photographs exactly what needed to be communicated without a single word being required. The hashtag that the palace's communications team had prepared in advance, not chosen spontaneously but prepositioned, waiting for the right moment, performed exactly as intended. The Royal Reclamation campaign began to lose its retail partners. Industry analysts noted the speed with which corporations moved away from an association that carried the specific combination of legal risk and public opinion pressure that the palace's response had generated. A YouGov survey showed public support for the Sussexes declining measurably, with a significant portion of respondents citing the use of a child's image in a campaign, targeting another child as the specific thing that had shifted their sympathy. Harry arrived at Heathrow alone, without announcement, in the weeks that followed the deletion and its consequences. The immediate assumption of the press, who noticed his arrival, was reconciliation, a reading of the situation that reflected their understanding of what arrivals like this usually meant in the history of the Sussex story, which had included enough unexpected pivots and reversals to make hope for resolution a persistent editorial instinct. The reality was more specific and more serious than reconciliation. He had arranged a private meeting with Princess Anne at her estate. The meeting lasted less than an hour. The people who had facilitated it described it afterward not as a warm reunion or a family conversation, but as something more closely resembling a formal exchange between two people who had concluded, independently and for different reasons, that clarity was more useful at this point than comfort. Harry had come with questions, Anne had answers. Whether the answers were what he had hoped for was not something she disclosed, and it was not something he discussed publicly. What she disclosed, when reporters asked subsequently whether reconciliation was possible, was 4 words that functioned as a complete institutional position statement. One cannot reconcile with methods. Those 4 words said everything the palace needed to say, and said it with the specific economy that is Anne's most recognizable communicative quality. They made clear that the institution no longer understood the Sussex situation as a family disagreement with emotional dimensions that might be resolved through conversation and compromise. It understood it as a planned operation, a methodology, in Anne's framing that had targeted the monarchy's reputation through the specific vehicle of children, using one child's perceived disadvantage to manufacture sympathy and using another child's perceived advantage to manufacture grievance. You do not reconcile with a methodology. You respond to it through the mechanisms the institution has available, and you maintain your position. The charity auction that followed A Future for Archie and Lilibet came to an abrupt end when observers noted that among the items on display was a tiara whose resemblance to a coronet associated with Princess Charlotte had been noticed and documented and shared widely enough that the palace's response was required. The palace's formal statement was 9 words. No royal object has been gifted, sold, or auctioned by the royal household. The auction ended. The brand damage was total and was at this point largely self-inflicted. The palace had not needed to do very much. It had simply maintained its position and allowed the royal reclamation campaign to demonstrate through its own actions exactly why the letters patent had said what they said. The thing that Meghan Markle never fully understood about the institution she was contesting, the thing that became visible only in retrospect, once the full sequence of the deletion and the letters patent and the sealed letter and the royal reclamation failure had played out, was the specific nature of the monarchy's advantage in any conflict conducted on the terrain of legitimacy. The monarchy does not compete in the emotional marketplace. It does not prove its worth through podcast revenue or demonstrate its authenticity through documentary series or establish its relevance through branded product lines that invite consumers to choose a side. It has 1,000 years of institutional inertia. It has the uncompromising, patient weight of constitutional law as interpreted across those 1,000 years by the specific mechanisms, the Privy Council, the letters patent, the College of Arms, the Lord Chamberlain's office, that exist precisely to apply that law without drama and without the need for public approval. These things cannot be replicated. They cannot be purchased. They cannot be patented under a trademark registered through a Delaware-based holding corporation. Prince George is the successor to the crown not because he has more spark than any other child, but because he was born into a life of responsibility that will require him, for the rest of his days, to subordinate his personal preferences to the needs of an institution he did not choose and cannot leave. That is not a benefit. It is a sacrifice of a kind and a duration that the Hollywood image consultants in that early year strategy meeting were not equipped to assess. The empty spaces on the royal website, the 2 vacant entries where Archie Harrison and Lilibet Diana had stood, are not simply missing names. They are the permanent digital record of a principle that the monarchy has maintained through constitutional crisis and dynastic conflict, and the specifically modern form of celebrity-driven institutional attack across its entire history. You cannot surrender your duty and still claim its rewards. You cannot forsake the responsibility and retain the privilege. The line is not a courtesy. It is the thing itself. The Sussexes sought freedom and were granted it. They found, as people generally find, that freedom from a particular structure also means freedom from that structure's protections and its resources, and the specific kind of standing that comes from belonging to something larger than yourself. The House of Windsor has moved on, not dramatically, not with press releases or emotional statements, but with the quiet and unhurried efficiency of an organization that understands its own continuity as the primary obligation it carries. A future king is being prepared. He understands, in ways appropriate to his age and increasing with every year, that his life belongs to the state rather than to himself. The cursor has moved on. The server rooms are quiet. And the 4 words Princess Anne offered to the cameras when she walked back out through the gates of her estate, one cannot reconcile with methods hang in the air above everything that followed as the clearest possible description of what the British monarchy is, what it has always been, and what no amount of spark can change.